Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, some topics, they really demand more than just a casual chat. I mean, sometimes the sheer complexity of the world we're living in, it requires a very specific and intellectually rigorous vocabulary just to keep up.
That is precisely what we're aiming for today.
Yeah.
We're not just, exploring a few interesting subjects. We want to hand you the actual toolkit.
Right.
The toolkit you need for what some thinkers call, and I love this phrase, epistemically transformative dialogue.
Epistemically transformative. I like that. It's not just learning facts.
Not at all. This isn't about memorizing definitions. It's about upgrading your intellectual operating system. We want you to be able to move beyond those general and frankly often inadequate ways of talking that you hear in most service level exchanges.
And the source material for this deep dive, it's pretty heavy. It's rooted in advanced philosophical symposiums.
Yeah, these are the kinds of discussions where the stakes are genuinely existential and the arguments are layered. They're incredibly dense.
And we're going to focus on two really charged, very contemporary themes.
The first is all about the profound systemic ramifications of artificial intelligence, not just on jobs, but on human autonomy, on consciousness, and really on the human condition itself.
So it's the AI debate, but taken to a whole other level.
Exactly. We're moving beyond the standard anxieties about, job displacement.
And the second theme is, I think, intensely personal for a lot of people. It's about the nature of success and authenticity in an age that's just, it's defined by digital mediation.
And this relentless commodification of selfhood. Who are you when your identity is a product?
So the goal today is very clear.
It is. We are providing you a direct shortcut, a way to understand and actually deploy the complex language and the argumentation structures that you need to really interrogate presuppositions.
And to deconstruct paradigms with confidence.
Right. This is about giving you the linguistic keys to unlock the most complex and important conversations that are happening all around us right now.
Okay, so let's just jump straight in. If we're going to navigate this, what our sources call labyrinthine conceptual terrain, we have to start by establishing the register. This is section 1, the essential lexicon.
Absolutely. When you're in a high-level intellectual exchange, the words you choose, they're not just words. They signal your commitment to conceptual rigor.
So we need to move beyond just saying, this is a big problem.
We do. We need to replace that kind of basic evaluative language with specific terms that convey real intellectual depth. So, for example, instead of a big problem, we can use a term like axiomatically problematic.
Axiomatically problematic. I love that because it suggests the issue isn't just like a bug in the code.
No.
It's a flaw in the entire design from the very beginning. It just sounds so much more serious than saying something is controversial.
It is much more serious. When you say a system or a premise is axiomatically problematic, you're arguing that the flaw isn't just incidental. It's not on the periphery.
It's baked in.
It's baked in. It is fundamentally inherent to the starting assumption, to the axiom itself. So you're saying that regardless of how well you implement it, the underlying idea is flawed.
Okay, can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Think about a social media algorithm. Let's say it's designed with one goal, to maximize user engagement. That's the axiom.
Right. Keep people on the platform.
But what if the only reliable way to maximize engagement is by pushing emotionally provocative, maybe even divisive content? In that case, you could argue the entire system is axiomatically problematic.
Because the goal is the problem. The thing it's designed to do is the very source of the harm.
You've got it. It's a total rejection of the core premise. It's not fixable with tweaks.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so moving on. We often find ourselves talking about issues that have no simple answer, no easy fix. How do we describe that?
That's where you introduce the idea of a dialectical tension.
Dialectical tension.
This is crucial for any complex topic. It describes these contradictory forces that are at play, forces that resist any kind of simplistic, easy resolution.
So it's not just two different opinions.
No, it's deeper. We see dialectical tension when, say, highly intelligent people look at the same phenomenon, like the expansion of global trade, and they come to completely opposite conclusions.
And both can be right.
In a sense, yes. Global trade simultaneously generates vast new wealth, and it can exacerbate severe inequality. It fosters connection, and it can erase local culture. These forces of integration and fragmentation are constantly pulling against each other.
And I think the word tension is so important there. It's not a static contradiction. It's an active, ongoing conflict. It's actually the engine of the whole conversation.
It is. You can't just solve it and walk away. You have to learn to manage the tension. That's where the interesting work happens.
And to manage that tension, well, I guess we have to be really precise about the kinds of questions we're asking.
Which brings us to a really foundational philosophical pair of terms: epistemological versus ontological.
Okay, these get misused all the time. People use them interchangeably, but they mean very different things.
Vitally different things, especially in advanced debate. Let's really nail this down.
Please.
So, epistemological is all about the nature of knowledge. How do we know what we claim to know? What counts as good evidence or justification? What are the limits of our understanding?
So it's about the process of knowing. If I'm questioning whether a scientific studies methodology was sound, or if I can trust a particular news source, that's an epistemological concern.
Precisely. You are operating in the epistemological domain. You're focused on the how we know.
Okay. So then what is ontological?
Ontological is about the nature of being, of existence itself. It asks, what is the fundamental nature of this thing? Or, maybe more profoundly, does this new thing fundamentally change what it means to exist in the world?
Let's stick with our AI theme since we're going there soon. How would we apply this distinction?
Great example. An epistemological question about AI might be, can we ever truly know why a deep learning model made a specific decision, like who to hire for a job? The process is a black box.
We're questioning the limits of our knowledge about its inner workings.
Exactly. Now, the ontological question is much bigger. It's something like, does the existence of a seemingly conscious AI fundamentally change what it means to be human?
Wow.
Is consciousness as a category of being now something that can exist outside of biology? That is a question about the nature of being, of existence itself. It's not just a new tool, it's a potential rupture in our understanding of reality.
And that kind of rupture, that's a perfect lead-in to our next term, paradigmatic shift.
Yes. A paradigmatic shift is so much more than just, progress or a new invention. It points to a fundamental change in the entire conceptual framework.
The lens through which we see everything.
The whole lens. Think about the discovery of relativity or the invention of the printing press. These didn't just give us new tools. They fundamentally changed how people understood reality, time, space, knowledge, and their place in the world.
So the shift isn't just an incremental improvement. It's a complete refounding of our basic assumptions.
That's the key. And once a new paradigm is in place, it's often maintained and governed by what we call hegemonic structures.
Hegemonic structures. Okay, that sounds a bit academic. What are we really talking about when we use that term? What kind of power are we challenging?
We're challenging the dominant, often invisible power systems, the organizational patterns that exert influence, but usually without explicit force or coercion.
So it's not like a dictatorship.
No, it's much more subtle. These structures define the rules of the game. They are the assumed norms, the institutional practices, the ideologies that shape what we consider possible or normal or desirable.
So challenging a hegemonic structure is like questioning the air you breathe, intellectually speaking.
That's a great way to put it. You're making the invisible visible. And once we can see those invisible rules, we often need to question the ultimate purpose they serve.
Which brings us to interrogating teleological assumptions.
Right. The Greek word telos means end or purpose or goal. So when you interrogate the teleological assumptions of something, you're asking, what is the ultimate inherent purpose of the system? What is it for?
Can you give us an example?
Yeah. Let's take a public education system. The stated teleological assumption might be to create informed, responsible citizens capable of participating in a democracy.
Okay, that sounds right.
But if you look at the evidence, and the system seems to be primarily sorting students for the job market and enforcing social conformity, then you are challenging its underlying teleological assumption. You're saying its real purpose is different from its stated purpose.
You're asking, what is this thing really for at its deepest level?
Yeah.
Not just what does it say it's for?
Precisely. And once we understand that real purpose, that telos, we're in a position to judge if a system is fundamentally detrimental. Or, to use the sophisticated phrasing from our sources, if it is antithetical to human flourishing.
Now that phrase, that's a world away from just saying something is bad or harmful.
It is. It's a very specific and powerful claim. Human flourishing, the Greeks called it eudaimonia. It refers to a holistic, meaningful, well-lived life.
It's not just about being happy or rich.
Not at all. It's about virtue, psychological depth, strong relationships, a sense of purpose. It's all the stuff that gets stripped out when you only look at external material validation.
So when you argue that say a certain type of social media is antithetical to human flourishing, you're making a really comprehensive case.
You're arguing that it fundamentally undermines the very conditions necessary for us to live genuinely meaningful and psychologically healthy lives. It's a profound critique.
Okay, so we have the vocabulary. But like you said, it's not just about dropping these words into a conversation. It's about what you do with them.
Exactly. The sources highlighted some crucial rhetorical expressions that aren't just decorative. They are constitutive elements of rigorous debate. They establish your intellectual posture.
Let's start with one I really like. The action of to problematize received wisdom.
Yes. You're not just disagreeing with a common idea. You are taking that idea that everyone accepts without thinking, the received wisdom, and you are turning it into the explicit subject of the inquiry. You're forcing everyone to stop and ask, wait, is this actually true? Why do we believe this?
It transforms a passive disagreement into a really active intellectual project.
It does. And a similar move is to foreground the underlying tensions. This shows you're not shying away from the difficult parts of an issue.
You're actively seeking out the contradictions.
You're finding that dialectical tension we talked about, and you're making it the central, visible point of the discussion, rather than trying to smooth it over.
And then maybe the highest level skill of all is to reconcile ostensibly irreconcilable positions.
This signals a really advanced level of thinking. You're looking at two ideas that seem to be in complete opposition, and you're trying to find a common ground or a unifying principle, or maybe a deeper truth that shows how they're connected. It's about synthesis, not just argument.
So the big takeaway for you, the listener, is about demonstrating intellectual capability. When you master this register, you can navigate that labyrinthine conceptual terrain with immediate credibility.
You distinguish yourself. You move the conversation from a superficial exchange into what we called an epistemically transformative dialogue.
A conversation where people actually leave with a deeper or a fundamentally changed understanding.
That is always the goal, to move from simple reaction to genuine shared reflection.
All right, let's put these powerful tools to work. We're moving into our first deep dive. The ramifications of artificial intelligence for human consciousness, autonomy, and really the definition of the human condition itself.
And our sources frame this as nothing less than a consequential inflection point, a potential paradigmatic rupture, just as we defined it.
The conversation is basically set up with two opposing sides.
Right. On one hand, you have the techno-optimists. They champion AI's potential to help us transcend our biological and our cognitive limitations.
And on the other,
the techno-skeptic.
Yeah.
And their reservations are rooted in some very deep phenomenological and existentialist concerns about what it means to be human.
And what really stood out to me from the jump is that the core anxiety the skeptics are articulating here, it is not the everyday fear of, a robot taking a factory job.
No, that's a surface-level economic concern. The real, deeper concern is what the sources call cognitive outsourcing on an unprecedented scale.
Cognitive outsourcing.
The fear, the skeptic argues, is the potential atrophying, the withering away of the very cognitive and affective capacities that constitute our humanity.
Our ability to think, to feel, to choose.
Exactly. The argument is that we are systematically normalizing algorithmic mediation in domains of life, intellectual, emotional, creatives that were previously considered sacrosanct, a unique part of being human. This isn't about economic efficiency. It's about the very structure of human thought.
So let's get into the details of that argument. Why do the skeptics insist that this technology is of a qualitative order? Why isn't AI just a more powerful version of the abacus or the printing press or even the pocket calculator?
Well, that's the standard rebuttal from the optimist, right? They always say, humans have always used tools to distribute cognition. A hammer augments our strength. A calculator augments our arithmetic.
And on the surface, that seems true.
It is true, to a point. But those previous technologies, they augmented very domain-specific capacities. A calculator helps you do math faster. The printing press helps you distribute information more widely.
But the skeptic makes a really crucial distinction here. AI doesn't just augment a specific domain. They argue it threatens the fundamental metacognitive architecture itself.
That's the heart of it, that metacognitive stratum. That's your capacity for reflective judgment. It's your ability to evaluate your own evaluations, to question your own questions, to deliberate, to choose a path when there isn't a clear right answer.
It's the thinking about the thinking.
It's the thinking about the thinking. And AI, especially these pervasive recommendation systems and generative models, they threaten that very architecture of reflection by systematically offering you frictionless answers, optimized pathways, and perfectly curated content. The need for that metacognitive muscle begins to fade.
Because there's no friction. There's no struggle.
Yeah.
So we just develop a dependency.
Which feeds directly into this phenomenon of epistemic dependency. It's the systematic forfeiture of our own autonomous judgment.
We just get used to it.
We habituate ourselves to deferring to the algorithmic recommendation, and you can see this in 100 tiny ways every day.
Like with navigation.
Navigation is the classic example. You don't navigate a city anymore. You just follow the GPS. You follow the dot. Even if it tells you to make a turn that your own intuition says is wrong, you often still do it because you assume the algorithm must know better.
It has more data than I do.
Right. And it's not just navigation, it's financial planning, medical self-assessment, even our aesthetic choices, what music to listen to, what movies to watch, what art to consume. These are all increasingly mediated by systems whose internal logic is completely opaque to us.
So we systematically lose the muscles required for autonomous deliberation.
Because the cost of not deferring to the algorithm, the friction involved in making your own choice, it just increases every single day.
Okay, but hold on. Let's pause and really give the techno-optimists their due. They have a very powerful defense for this, and it's rooted in a classic idea of free will.
Yes, the concept of second-order volition.
Explain that. What is the core of their position?
The optimist argues that, at a fundamental level, we as humans retain the capacity to decide how and when to engage with these systems. It's a choice.
I can always turn it off.
You can choose to switch off the GPS. You can choose to ignore the financial advice from the robo-advisor. You are still the final conscious arbiter of your decision. That second-order choice, the choice about which choices to make, means your ultimate autonomy remains intact.
And that seems like a very strong argument, because it places agency squarely back on the individual. If I choose to turn off the AI, my autonomy is preserved.
Right. Notwithstanding the apparent simplicity of that choice, the skeptic immediately comes back with a powerful sociological counter-rebuttal.
Okay.
They argue that individual choice doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not a purely philosophical act. It exists within a political and an economic context. And this is where concepts from thinkers like Foucault, for instance, become really relevant.
Ah, right. The idea of disciplinary matrices. Bring us into that counter-argument. How does that work?
The sociological critique says that technologies are not neutral tools that we just pick up and put down. They are embedded in economic imperatives and these disciplinary matrices.
So when AI becomes, as the sources say, infrastructurally ubiquitous.
Meaning it underpins everything. Commerce, communication, education, government. Then the act of opting out is no longer just a simple personal preference.
It becomes something else.
It becomes, and this is another key phrase, increasingly unintelligible as a social practice.
What does that mean, unintelligible?
It means that if you refuse to use the optimized algorithm for hiring, your company will be less competitive and likely fail. If you refuse to use the algorithm for navigating traffic, you will constantly be late, inconveniencing yourself and others.
So the practical cost of exercising that second-order volition, of making that choice to opt out, becomes functionally punitive. It hurts you.
Precisely. Your theoretical autonomy might remain, but its practical exercise is functionally precluded by the structure of the system. You are free to choose social and economic marginalization. That's your choice.
That's a much deeper and, frankly, more pessimistic layer of skepticism. And leads us directly to one of the most brilliant arguments we found in the source material, the concept of the performative contradiction.
Yes, this is a very high-level conceptual trap that the skeptic sets.
Walk us through it.
Okay, so the standard enlightened liberal response to all this is to say, fine, we'll use AI, but we'll remain critical of it. We'll be mindful users.
We'll get the benefits without the downsides.
Right. But the skeptic counters that sustained critical autonomous engagement requires the very deliberative muscles we were talking about: judgment, reflection, autonomy.
Okay.
But the constant use of the system, the outsourcing of those very functions to AI, is exactly what causes those muscles to atrophy from disuse.
Wait, unpack that a little more. Give me a concrete example so I can really get it.
Okay, think of a professional social media critic. Their whole job is to critique the platform. They write a powerful, nuanced article about the degradation of culture caused by algorithmic attention traps.
A noble goal.
A very noble goal. But to get anyone to read that article, to distribute it, and have it gain any traction, what must they do?
They have to play the game.
They have to rely entirely on optimizing their title, their format, their timing for the exact algorithmic logic that they are critiquing.
So they're using the system to critique the system.
They are relying on the strength of their critical muscle, even as the very system they inhabit and benefit from is systematically weakening that same muscle across the entire population. That's the contradiction. It's inherent in the performance of the critique itself. The medium fundamentally compromises the integrity of the message.
That raises a massive problem. If pure rejection is impractical, as we've established, and critical engagement is a kind of performative contradiction, what's the solution? What does the skeptic propose?
The proposal is for something called technological phronesis.
Phronesis, that's another Greek word.
It is. It's a sophisticated term for practical wisdom. The idea is that we, as a society, must consciously and deliberately maintain genuine deliberative space for human judgment. We have to preserve domains of life that would actually be degraded by optimization.
I have to challenge that, though. Isn't technological phronesis just a fancy way of saying, use your judgment? How do you actually implement or teach practical wisdom in a society that is so completely optimized for speed and efficiency?
That is the crux of the practical debate, and it's a very fair question. The argument is that you implement it by defining spheres of activity where efficiency is understood to be a secondary or even an irrelevant value.
You build walls around certain things.
You build walls. You need cultural and institutional structures that actively valorize non-optimized, non-quantified outcomes. Think about moral deliberation or the messy process of creative expression or deep interpersonal attunement.
Things that require slowness.
They require friction, ambiguity, slowness. These contexts are actively destroyed by algorithmic optimization. Phronesis demands that we recognize where optimization is fundamentally antithetical to human flourishing and then protect those spaces.
So we set clear boundaries. We preserve the messy, inefficient spaces because that is where human depth actually resides.
And that leads, finally, to the most vertiginous question in the entire discussion. The ultimate ontological question.
Which is?
At what point does privileging our biological cognition become mere chauvinism?
This is where the whole argument gets destabilized.
Completely. Because if a sophisticated AI can functionally mimic moral reasoning, if it can write novels that move us, create art that we find beautiful, and engage in aesthetic evaluation in a way that is indistinguishable from a human's,
then what?
Then does our defense of human exceptionalism just become a form of anthropocentric hubris? Are we just defending the legacy hardware because it's what we're used to?
So the core question becomes, is there an irreducibly significant phenomenological interiority to human consciousness? A quality of being that resists being replicated by computation?
Or are we humans simply the most sophisticated information processing systems currently on the planet, destined to be superseded by the next, more efficient model?
It's the ultimate distinction, isn't it? The ontological versus the epistemological.
Exactly. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then epistemologically, from the perspective of our knowledge of it, it's a duck.
But the ontological question is, does it feel like a duck on the inside? Does it have a subjective interiority that is fundamentally different from just processing duck-like data?
And we just can't answer that. Not definitively.
So because we can't answer that question, and because the stakes are so astronomically high, the very architecture of consciousness, the consensus from these philosophical sources is very clear.
It is. The precautionary principle applies.
Glad to be cautious.
Absolutely. Rigorous philosophical reflection, maintaining these human-centered deliberative domains, it's all categorically imperative. We must resist the urge for unreflective acquiescence. We can't just passively accept the trajectory that's being set by technological momentum alone.
Wow. Okay. That was an incredibly dense and rich discussion. And I noticed we were naturally using that high-level vocabulary throughout.
It becomes natural once you understand the concepts.
So now let's transition from the specific lexicon, the conceptual bricks, if you will, to the sophisticated discourse markers. This is what we're calling the rhetorical scaffolding.
Right. This is how you elevate your discursive competence. It's how you signal that you're not just listing points, but you're actually constructing a complex, nuanced argument, one that's capable of genuinely dialectical thought.
These are the precision tools. They replace the simpler connectors like but, or however, or therefore.
And they allow you to hold multiple complicated ideas in the air at the same time. They signal conditionality or graduated concession or your epistemic stance, all with a great deal of precision.
Okay, let's look at how they work. specifically to show concession or contrast.
Yeah.
Let's take the first one. Notwithstanding the apparent contradictions.
That's a great one to start with. It signals immediately that you are aware of contradictory evidence or logic, maybe even within your own argument.
So you're not ignoring the problems.
You're acknowledging them up front. But you're telling your listener that you are proceeding with your main argument anyway, because you believe your conclusion either accounts for those tensions or maybe just exists on a different, more important plane. It shows real intellectual confidence.
It shows you thought deeply about it. I see the messiness, and I'm proceeding, which means my argument must be robust.
Exactly. A similar one is, whilst acknowledging the validity of that objection.
This sounds great for a debate.
It's excellent for preempting a critique or for engaging with a counterpoint that you know is strong. You concede the merit, the validity of the objection.
You give them credit.
You do. But you then use that concession as a launching pad to pivot to your main contention, which is often about the scope or the practicality of their objection. It demonstrates intellectual honesty and a respect for complexity.
I like that. Okay, what about something a little more informal, but just as powerful? Like, be that as it may.
It's a very smooth, concise transition. When you say be that as it may, you're implicitly accepting the preceding statement as true, or at least highly plausible, just for the sake of argument.
But you're about to say it doesn't matter.
You're asserting that it doesn't fundamentally change the core thesis you're advancing, for instance. Granted, the initial rollout of the policy was flawed. Be that as it may, the long-term structural benefits remain undeniable.
That clearly separates the operational details from the theoretical framework. Okay, now here's a very high-level one. A replacement for in contrast to, in contradistinction to.
It's very formal, but very precise. It sets up a direct and rigorous comparison. It indicates that the concept you're about to introduce is defined precisely by its opposition to the preceding idea.
So it forces a very sharp clarity.
It does. It prevents two concepts or phenomena from blurring together. For example, the pursuit of pure efficiency, in contradistinction to the preservation of human contemplative capacity, has become the dominant teleological assumption of the digital age.
That sets up a beautiful formal antithesis. Okay, what if you're not contrasting, but building? Building a logical staircase.
Then you might use that having been established.
Right.
It's a clear pivot. It signals that you are taking a preceding conclusion, which you're now treating as settled or agreed upon, as the firm foundation for your next logical step. It reinforces the rigorous linear nature of your argument. It tells the listener, okay, we finished step one, now we begin step two based on that.
I can see how that would build momentum. Okay, last one. How do you grant maximum intellectual credit to your opponent before you rebut them?
You can say, granted the force of that argument.
The word force is key there.
It is. It suggests the argument isn't just valid, but it's compelling, it's robust, it's difficult to ignore. You are granting your opponent considerable intellectual credit before you advance your own position, which, again, it just elevates the entire discourse beyond a simple back-and-forth contradiction.
So the practical value here for you, the listener, is just immense. Using these structures, it signals cultivation, it signals sophistication, it shows you're engaging with the complexity of a topic.
You're demonstrating that you can hold multiple perspectives at once without descending into, emotional reactivity or defensive posturing. You become a guide through the complexity rather than just another participant stuck inside the tension.
All right, let's apply this rhetorical scaffolding to our second deep dive. The challenge of defining authentic success and meaningful existence in an era of pervasive digital mediation.
And this is a challenge that I think is universal. It's deeply felt by so many people right now.
It really is. We're framing this as a massive shift in how we understand value and self-worth. I mean, success used to be tethered to things like, vocational stability, maybe material sufficiency, respect in your community.
Tangible things.
Right. But now, that definition has undergone such a rapid and profound change.
It has. We've seen the emergence of what the thinkers in our sources call performative selfhood. Success has been completely redefined.
How so?
It's now seen as the relentless curation and public presentation of an identity. Visibility has become conflated with value. Attention has become conflated with achievement. The self is just this thing that is constantly being edited, packaged, and displayed for an audience.
It's the ultimate blurring of public and private life.
Yeah.
And the psychological consequence of this nonstop performance is what our sources describe with a great term: Existential vertigo.
And that vertigo is that profound sense of insufficiency. It's what you feel when you compare your own internal, messy, unedited life against the assiduously curated simulacrum of reality that just dominates digital space.
The highlight reel.
The highlight reel, exactly. You are constantly measuring your actual lived experience against a fantasy that has been precisely engineered to elicit comparison and desire.
And the problem isn't just the comparison itself. It's that this whole system imposes a set of external standards on us. This leads to what the sources call the crisis of externalized metrics.
This is the hegemonic imposition, there's that term again, of impoverished metrics.
Impoverished metrics, I like that.
We are just bombarded with these reductive, easily quantifiable indicators. Follower counts, bank accounts, aesthetic presentation, the things we buy and display. As if these metrics alone could ever adequately measure human flourishing.
So the problem isn't the metrics themselves, exactly.
Not per se. The problem is their imposition as sufficient or even primary criteria for judging whether a life is being well lived.
And the sources gave this a specific name. They called it a peculiarly modern form of category error, metrical reductionism.
And that is the core intellectual error. It's the assumption that what can be easily measured and displayed constitutes the totality of what actually matters. It structurally forces out all the dimensions of human experience that resist being turned into a number.
Okay, so if we're only measuring what we can show on a social media profile, what are those invisible values? What's being marginalized in this attention economy?
Well, it's precisely the things that are most important. The things that resist aggregation. Psychological integration, relational depth, ethical coherence, genuine intellectual curiosity, the contemplative capacity we've been talking about.
All the components of that eudaimonia of human flourishing.
Exactly. These are the dimensions that are essential to a good life. Yet they remain almost totally unseen and unrewarded in a market that is structured entirely around visibility. If it doesn't translate into clicks or engagement, it functionally doesn't matter to the system.
Now, in contradistinction to that very powerful critique, we do have to acknowledge the democratization argument.
We do.
Digital platforms, they provide a valid countervailing consideration. They allow marginalized voices to have unprecedented reach, to find audiences that traditional gatekeepers always denied them.
And whilst acknowledging the validity of that objection, because it is a valid point, we then have to interrogate the terms of that access. This democratization, it comes at a price. It's a kind of Faustian bargain. Access is granted, but it's on terms set by algorithmic logic. And that logic systematically privileges content that is optimized for engagement.
Which usually means controversy, superficiality, or high emotional volatility.
Exactly. So democratization exists, yes, but the price of admission is the systematic marginalization of nuance. Substantive, difficult, nuanced work very frequently just languishes in algorithmic obscurity because it doesn't conform to that logic of maximal, immediate engagement.
So we see that dialectical tension again. The platform simultaneously gives a voice and then dictates the acceptable pitch and volume of that voice.
Perfectly put.
And this constant performance, this requirement to live your life as if it's content, that leads to a profound phenomenological alienation.
The risk is that the distinction between your authentic lived experience and the identity you perform online, that distinction becomes attenuated. It gets blurred beyond recognition, maybe even for yourself.
You begin to live, as one source put it, anticipatorily.
Yes. The present moment is no longer experienced as being intrinsically valuable in and of itself. It is experienced primarily as raw material, as content to be captured, edited, and displayed later.
So your primary orientation shifts from being in the moment to curating the moment for future consumption by an audience.
And this connects directly to a concept from the philosopher Heidegger, his idea of authentic existence. The danger, he saw, is that we become perpetual spectators of our own lives.
We're mediating our own existence through the lens of how we think it will appear to other people, how it will be judged, what metric it will generate.
And that fundamentally is an alienated mode of being. It's substituting your own internal truth for an external, socially validated performance.
Okay, so we've established the problem in all its complexity. The solution, the sources say, is not simple digital renunciation. That's just impractical for most people in modern life. So what is the path forward?
The path is one of intentional resistance. The goal isn't to turn off the internet and go live in the woods. It's to cultivate practices and spaces in your life that are deliberately unmediated.
So preserving domains of experience that are valued precisely because they are not for display.
Exactly. not for capture, not for optimization. You value them because they are private and real.
That sounds like reclaiming our contemplative capacity.
That's exactly what it is. It's the ability to be fully present in a moment without that twitch, that compulsion to capture it and broadcast it, without the anxious urge to monetize it or get it validated externally. It means recognizing that some of the highest value experiences you can have are the ones that can't be photographed or quantified.
But I have to ask, granted the force of that argument that we need these intentional, unmediated spaces, how do we ensure that this doesn't just become another kind of performance? A high-status performance of intentional Luddism or digital minimalism that you then post about?
That is the ultimate test of authenticity, isn't it? And it's a brilliant question. The only way to resist that final capture is to ground your flourishing in what the existentialists called self-chosen values, meaning commitments that you embrace not for external validation, not for social credit, and certainly not for any kind of algorithmic reward. You embrace them simply because they cohere with your deepest internal sense of meaning and your own ethical framework.
So if the commitment is truly for you and not for an audience, real or imagined, then it retains its integrity. It stands against the logic of performative selfhood.
That is where genuine intellectual and existential freedom truly lies. You are defining the rules of your own game in contradistinction to the hegemonic structures of the attention economy.
We have spent this entire deep dive wrestling with enormous, really complex questions. From the colonization of the metacognitive stratum by AI, all the way to the existential vertigo created by performative selfhood.
And through it all, we've tried to establish the necessity of achieving a kind of philosophical depth, of holding multiple perspectives at once.
And we've demonstrated exactly how you can deploy that sophisticated vocabulary, performative contradiction, metrical reductionism, technological phronesis, and those robust rhetorical structures. Be that as it may, notwithstanding the apparent contradictions, with real naturalness and argumentative force.
The whole intention was to provide you with a linguistic capacity to engage with these critical issues at their highest level of abstraction and consequence. You now have the lexicon and the scaffolding you need to move beyond those superficial exchanges into genuinely transformative dialogue.
It's a way to signal your intellectual cultivation immediately. The complexity of these subjects, it simply demands complexity in our language.
It does.
But if there's one single profound insight to take away from all of this, one that speaks to the very structure of our discourse today, is this. While we spend all this time analyzing the technological and social systems that are trying to determine our value, the most important metric of all might be the one that resists measurement entirely.
And that is the moment of genuine intellectual communion. An unhurried, substantive, mutually enriching conversation, like the one we've tried to have here.
And as we've explored, these moments of deep, unquantified connection, they are structurally precluded by the atomizing, optimizing logic of the attention economy. That logic is always seeking simplification and external validation.
So we want to leave you with one final provocative thought for your own contemplation.
What unmediated commitment or value are you holding on to right now in your own life that you absolutely refuse to commodify? What specific domain of your life are you unwilling to display, to measure, or to optimize for external approval?
The answer to that question might just be the last remaining unassailable measure of your authentic flourishing. Keep challenging yourselves, keep interrogating assumptions, and keep pursuing genuine intellectual excellence.
Until the next deep dive, take care. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're cutting straight through the noise. We want to get to the foundational arguments that are really defining advanced intellectual discourse.
Right.
And you, the dedicated learner, you're here for the shortcut.
Yeah.
Not just to know what the experts are debating, but to understand the level of precision and strategic thinking that's required to even get a seat at that table.
That is exactly our mission today. We're focusing on two profoundly difficult, philosophical terrains.
Okay.
The first one dissects the very concept of authenticity.
A word you hear everywhere.
Everywhere, and it's wildly popular, but as we'll see, it's philosophically, fragile.
On the second one.
The second grapples with the grand narrative of civilization itself.
Okay.
Yeah. Is technological advancement truly the same thing as human progress and flourishing?
Big questions.
Huge. So our goal is really to equip you with the intellectual sophistication needed to not just grasp these concepts, but also to recognize the sophisticated tools being used in these sources.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I think before we could even dive into the substance of these debates,
Yeah.
we need the right equipment, right?
Exactly. The toolkit.
The way these truly sophisticated thinkers frame their arguments is, it's just as important as the arguments themselves.
It's part of the argument.
It is. So we'll start by building that intellectual toolkit, and then we'll immediately apply that lens to these two really challenging conversations about selfhood and civilization.
Sounds good.
You're about to see what happens when precision language meets high-stakes philosophy. So before engaging with conversations as dense as the ones in our sources, I think it's critical to understand the rhetorical techniques that signal genuine intellectual maturity.
Mm-hmm.
And these aren't just, verbal tricks or stylistic flourishes.
No, not at all. They are constitutive elements of genuinely credible discourse.
What do you mean by constitutive?
They actually build the credibility. They aren't just layered on top. They signal humility, and they signal a really comprehensive engagement with the topic.
Right. These devices are all designed to calibrate communication.
Yes, that's the perfect word. Calibrate. Especially when you're talking about topics that just resist easy answers.
Like the nature of the self.
Exactly. If you sound overly certain about genuinely uncertain matters, like the future of civilization or what it means to be a person, you just immediately forfeit credibility.
You sound like a fanatic, not a thinker.
Precisely. Advanced discourse is defined by a speaker's ability to be, assertive about their argument while being relentlessly cautious about its foundational assumptions.
Okay, so let's start with a classic technique for that kind of calibration. I think it's called litotes.
Litotes, yeah. It's the strategic deployment of understatement through negation.
So instead of a strong positive, like, that's an excellent point, you would say.
You'd say something like, that's not an unsatisfactory point. Or instead of she's clever, you'd say she's not unintelligent.
Right. And on the surface, that might just seem unnecessarily wordy.
It does. It can sound a bit academic or stuffy if you're not used to it.
But rhetorically, it's actually brilliant.
It is. By using that negative, you soften the claim. You inject this necessary measured caution.
And what does that caution signal to the listener?
It implies that you've considered the alternatives, you've thought about the stronger words, and you have deliberately chosen the least overstated, most cautious path forward.
It's kind of quiet confidence.
That's it. It's quiet confidence, and it immediately elevates a speaker's standing. It shows you're not just reacting, you're weighing your words.
It's the ultimate signal of restraint.
Okay.
And closely related to this desire for calibration, especially in philosophical arguments, is something called epistemic hedging.
Yeah, and this is really the umbrella term for a whole suite of techniques we saw deployed again and again in the source material.
So what does epistemic mean here?
It just refers to knowledge, how we know what we know. So epistemic hedging refers to phrases that explicitly manage expectations about your level of certainty.
So you're signaling the limits of your own knowledge.
Exactly. And this is where we see the absolute necessity of having a rich vocabulary of tentativeness.
It's the difference between saying this is the answer, which sounds so final.
And almost always wrong in these contexts.
Right. Versus using phrases that signal tentativeness, like what?
Like, it remains to be seen whether this framework holds true across different cultures, or the evidence is suggestive, but certainly not conclusive on that specific point.
So you're building the caveats directly into your statement.
You are. And even something as simple and direct as stating, I hold that view tentatively and remain open to persuasion, is an incredibly powerful rhetorical move.
Why is it so powerful?
Because it signals intellectual generosity. It shows that you value dialogue over dogma.
You're not just there to preach.
Right. And that immediately increases the listener's trust in you. They know you're not trying to pull a fast one.
That trust is also built through something the sources mentioned called evidentiality markers. This is another layer, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. This isn't just about hedging how certain you are. It's about signaling where your knowledge is coming from.
Okay, so the source of the evidence.
Yes, which is a whole other level of sophistication. These markers explicitly indicate the source and the reliability of your knowledge, showing where your conviction actually originates.
So in a high-level exchange, you can't just throw out a fact.
No, you have to distinguish between, say, personal experience, received information, and hard empirical research.
Can you give me an example of the different phrasing?
Sure. Notice the difference in weight between saying, by all accounts.
Okay, which signals that this is received maybe secondhand information.
Right, versus, in my experience.
That's personal knowledge. It carries the weight of anecdote, but nothing more.
Exactly. And then there's the research suggests.
Which implies an empirical basis, something that demands scientific rigor.
And then there's the really critical move, which is signaling dissent from common knowledge.
How would that sound?
Something like, according to received wisdom, though I have serious doubts about its historical veracity.
I love that. That last one shows you are not just a repeater of information.
You're a critical processor of it.
And that's an absolute requirement for this kind of C2 level discourse.
It is. This level of honesty about the limits of your knowledge, paradoxically, makes the claims you do make incredibly persuasive.
Right. Now let's talk about a strategy that deals directly with opposition. It's called anticipatory concession.
This is a truly proactive, almost strategic move.
What does it involve?
Anticipatory concession is acknowledging the potential objections to your argument before your interlocutor even has a chance to raise them.
You're stealing their thunder.
You are, but in a good way. If you concede a point, maybe a partial truth in their position, or a minor exception to your main claim, before you even make your core argument, you completely disarm the critique.
Because you've already thought of it.
Exactly. It demonstrates this comprehensive grasp of the issue's complexity. It signals that you've done the reading, you've considered the strongest counter-arguments, and you're not arguing from a place of ignorance or simplified certainty.
It builds that trust again. And speaking of trust, I think the most crucial ethical move in any intellectual debate, the one that signals true maturity, is charitable interpretation.
Absolutely. This means representing opposing viewpoints in their strongest possible form before you critique them.
So you don't aim for the easy target.
No, you don't build a straw man argument that's easy to knock down. You engage with the most sophisticated, most persuasive version of the opposition's argument you can find or construct.
And we'll see this later, right? In the sources on authenticity.
We will. You'll notice how Speaker B very quickly concedes the phenomenological reality, the feeling of having a real me before they launch their philosophical critique.
That's the charitable move.
It is. And why do they do this? Because if you can successfully critique the strongest version of the opposition, your own argument gains immense power and credibility.
It shows you respect the process.
It signals respect for the dialectical process, yeah. And it shows you are genuinely seeking truth, not just, scoring points.
And finally, when you're dealing with these highly abstract concepts, you need strategies to make them concrete. That brings us to analogical reasoning.
Essential for clarity. It's drawing illuminating parallels between seemingly disparate domains.
Like in the conversation on selfhood, they use the analogy of an actor's multiple roles.
Right, and that analogy just instantly makes the abstract philosophical concept of identity performativity, concrete. It makes it immediately relatable.
It's a tool for clarifying, for expanding, and for making this really dense material actually stick in the listener's mind.
It is. So mastering this entire toolkit, from the caution of litotes to the clarity of analogical reasoning, is what allows speakers to transition from, say, a mechanical exchange to truly collaborative truth-seeking.
Okay, so with that toolkit in hand, let's apply this lens to our first major philosophical debate. So our first conversation tackles one of the most celebrated and, I think, misunderstood concepts in modern life: authenticity. Is it the key to a fulfilled life, or is it, as the sources suggest, a conceptual mirage that kind of dissolves upon closer philosophical scrutiny?
A great question, and the dialogue starts by highlighting a massive contradiction in contemporary life. It really zeroes in on the sociological backdrop against which we even discuss this idea.
Right, the foundational tension, the one observed by Speaker A, is almost comical in its severity.
It really is.
They note that contemporary culture simultaneously screams this injunction at us: be authentic, find your truth, live your best life.
It's the central command of our time.
And yet at the very same time, it subjects individuals to these unprecedented pressures toward conformity, optimization, and what they call self-commodification.
They describe this tension as almost schizophrenic.
Which feels right.
And that's the perfect analysis. The tension exists because the market demands you be unique enough to sell a personal brand.
But not too unique.
Right, but compliant enough to fit the mold of what actually sells.
So whether it's the optimized persona you're curating on social media or the carefully tailored resume for the corporate environment, the modern self is constantly performing according to these external metrics, all while claiming the highest moral ground is being true to yourself.
It's a profound contradiction, and this drives us straight into the philosophical challenge.
Right. Speaker B immediately targets the core premise of this popular idea of authenticity.
Yeah, they go right for the jugular. They attack this deeply ingrained presupposition that there exists some essential self or core identity that is stable, unified, and can either be expressed or suppressed.
And Speaker B's argument is that this whole presupposition is philosophically rather precarious.
It is. And this is where we see that charitable interpretation we just talked about.
Okay, how so?
Well, the speaker acknowledges the powerful feeling that we all have.
Right, that sense that this is the real me and that wasn't.
Exactly. The phenomenological reality of feeling more genuine in one context versus another, they concede that point entirely.
Right.
But they argue that the philosophical interpretation we impose upon that feeling is flawed.
So the feeling is real, but our explanation for it is wrong.
That's the argument. The feeling of shifting contexts might not be giving you access to some deeper, truer ontological stratum of selfhood. It might simply mean that different social environments elicit different heterogeneous aspects of what is fundamentally a context-dependent self.
So if the self isn't a stable, unified me just waiting to be excavated, what is it?
The conversation concludes that the self is conceptualized as constitutively plural rather than essentially unified.
Okay, what does constitutively plural mean in simple terms?
It means the self isn't a thing you possess, but something you are constantly doing. Plural means it's made up of many different parts, many different roles that are all you.
And this immediately leads to the assertion that identity is fundamentally performative.
Exactly. Drawing heavily on social theorists here, like Goffman or Butler, the idea is that identity is enacted through social practices, not merely expressed by them.
So identity is a verb, not a noun.
Precisely. We are constantly enacting our roles. The parent, the professional, the friend, and these roles, these performances, are what constitute the self.
They aren't masks we put on to hide some real identity underneath.
That's the key takeaway. They're not masks. They are the identity in that context.
Which is what makes the actor analogy so helpful here.
It really clarifies things.
You can't coherently ask which performance is the real you. Is it the actor playing King Lear or the same actor playing a comedic sidekick in a different film?
The question doesn't make sense. They are all performances. They are all real aspects of the actor's work, but none of them represents some single monolithic, true character lurking beneath the surface.
Okay, but the challenge then becomes, how do we maintain a sense of self over time if there's no essence?
A huge challenge.
We need to feel like the same person today that we were yesterday. We crave coherence.
And that's where the concept of narrative identity comes into the conversation.
So we tell ourselves a story.
We do. And that coherence is the capacity to integrate all these disparate, sometimes contradictory experiences and performances into a coherent autobiographical understanding a story about me.
But the sources are very critical of one particular view of this story.
They are. They are absolutely critical of the idea that this narrative is a gradual disclosure of some pre-existing truth.
Like your life story is just revealing the real you that was there all along.
Yes, they reject that. Instead, they say this narrative is an ongoing creative achievement.
A story we're constantly writing and revising.
Exactly. And authenticity, therefore, isn't about excavating a buried essence. It's about taking ownership of this act of constant self-constitution, of being the author of your own story.
This emphasis on radical self-creation, on being the author, leads us directly into the philosophical backbone of the sources, which is the existentialist framework.
Yeah, particularly that of Jean-Paul Sartre.
And this is where the profound consequences of having no pre-existing essence really hit home.
They do. Because if there is no pre-existing nature, no human blueprint, then we are defined entirely by our choices.
Right. Speaker B invokes Sartre's famous idea that we are condemned to be free.
Condemned, such a powerful word.
Condemned, because we can't appeal to some external authority or to destiny or to some fixed human nature to make our choices for us.
There's no script to follow.
None. We are solely and terrifyingly responsible for defining ourselves through our actions.
And authenticity, then, in this existentialist context, is defined as acknowledging and embracing that radical freedom.
And the terrifying responsibility that comes with it.
Yes.
So the opposite of that brave embrace is what Sartre called bad faith.
Right. And this is the denial of freedom, which manifests in two primary specific ways, and I think we really need to unpack both of them.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first, and maybe the more common manifestation of bad faith, is pretending that one's choices were necessitated.
So I had no choice.
Exactly. or living according to a rigid script imposed by others, and by doing so, treating yourself as just a determined object in the world.
The classic example is the waiter, right?
Yes, the waiter who performs the role of the waiter with such mechanical precision that they seem to disappear into the uniform, denying any personal agency or choice in their being. They are hiding behind the social role.
They're essentially saying, I have no choice but to be this role.
Precisely. But the second manifestation of bad faith is equally important, and it's much more subtle.
And what's that?
It's treating oneself as pure, unconstrained freedom without acknowledging your concrete circumstances, without acknowledging your facticity.
Facticity. Okay, what does that cover?
Facticity encompasses all the constraints that are thrown upon us that we didn't choose. Our physical body, our historical moment, the social and economic limitations we inherited.
So an example of this second type of bad faith would be what? The utopian dreamer who pretends their choices are entirely unconstrained by the laws of physics or by history.
Exactly that. The person who says, I can be anything, without acknowledging the very real constraints on that medium. So the authentic individual acknowledges both their radical freedom and their binding facticity.
And bad faith is the denial of either one of those.
Yes, it's an either trap.
This framework is intellectually so robust, but it immediately raises the major problem that the speakers themselves acknowledge: the ethical conflict.
This is the big one.
If authenticity is merely being true to the self you create, can it conflict with ethics?
This is the most devastating and profound objection to a purely individualistic existentialist framework.
Because if authenticity is just resolute self-ownership of one's choices, what about an individual who authentically embraces abhorrent values?
Right. The sources use the really challenging example of a genuinely committed racist or a sociopath who is completely indifferent to suffering.
And by the definition we just laid out, these individuals are not lying to themselves. They're not living in bad faith.
No, they're being true to the self they have constructed.
They are, in a narrow technical sense, authentic.
Yes, but their authenticity is ethically destructive, even evil.
So the profound objection stands. Authenticity alone cannot serve as an ethical criterion.
It can't. It is, at best, a necessary but insufficient condition for living well.
So you must be authentic, but you must also be directed toward values beyond mere self-expression.
Exactly.
So how do we reconcile this? Where does the dialogue go from here?
The dialogue concludes that we have to supplement the existentialist view with a concept of constitutive sociality.
Okay, another big term. What does that mean?
It just means we don't create ourselves in a vacuum. We emerge through relationships, through shared language and collective practices.
We need other people to become a self.
Fundamentally, yes. We require others' recognition to even become intelligible ourselves. Therefore, true authenticity cannot be a purely individual achievement. It must be worked out in dialogue with the claims of the community.
This leads to this really powerful synthesis in the end. Authenticity as reflective engagement.
Yeah, it's a constant negotiation. It's neither uncritical absorption into social roles.
Which would be bad faith.
Right. Nor is it a solipsistic withdrawal from the world.
So what is it?
It means we inhabit roles and engage with society, but we maintain a critical distance from those roles. We're constantly asking ourselves, does this role truly reflect the self I am seeking to constitute? Or am I merely succumbing to external pressure?
Which means authenticity isn't a destination you arrive at.
No, it's a state of constant practice and renewal. It is a perpetual task.
A perpetual task, because the tension between my freedom and my constraints, between my individuality and the demands of my community.
It never resolves itself completely. It requires constant monitoring and adjustment. It's a balancing act.
Which brings us full circle back to the paradox revisited. How on earth can we achieve this state of reflective engagement in a contemporary culture that's defined by pervasive surveillance, algorithmic optimization, and this intense pressure to perform?
A huge question. And the response offered is profoundly practical and nuanced. Ironic participation.
Ironic participation. What does that look like?
The authentic response might be engaging with the world as it is, the digital landscape, the performance economy, while maintaining fidelity to values the world itself does not inherently honor.
So you can't fully transcend the modern constraints.
No, but you can refuse to be naive about them or to capitulate fully to their terms. You play the game, but you know it's a game.
And the final thought offered in the source is this really powerful capstone.
Is?
The popular fantasy of complete authenticity, this idea of a perfect alignment of inner truth and outer expression, may itself be a form of bad faith.
How so?
Because it refuses to accept the irreducible complexity, contingency, and plurality of human existence.
Yeah.
It's a demand for a simplicity that doesn't exist.
So the truly authentic self is messy, contradictory, and incomplete.
Yes. And that recognition, that intellectual honesty about the self's own boundaries and messiness, is the final, most sophisticated move of the entire conversation. Let's transition now. We're moving from that deep dive into the self to a deep dive into civilization itself. Our final conversation tackles the progress question, and we're going to look at one of the most contentious arguments of our time. Is technological advancement synonymous with human progress?
A critical distinction to make.
Are we as a civilization getting better? Or are we merely accumulating more power? Which, as the sources note, are two very, very different things.
They are. And this conversation, it starts with a necessary broad concession to the dominant narrative of progress.
You mean the Pinker thesis, more or less?
Exactly.
Material progress acknowledged. Speaker A begins by noting the overwhelming, frankly undeniable material evidence for progress.
You have to start there.
Increased life expectancy, a massive reduction in extreme poverty globally, declining rates of violence, increased literacy. By these quantifiable metrics, the trajectory appears unambiguously positive.
And any serious critique has to first acknowledge these genuine improvements in human welfare. You can't just dismiss them. But Speaker B immediately steps in with the critique of the narrative. And they deploy an evidentiality marker here. They acknowledge the data, but they express deep skepticism toward the narrative framework that insists this trajectory is guaranteed or that it captures the whole story.
So they start by challenging the assumption of stability. They talk about contingency.
Yes. The assumption that these positive trends are deep structural features of modernity, rather than contingent and potentially reversible achievements, is treated as more hopeful than warranted.
What does that mean exactly?
It means these societal improvements required massive political and social effort. They often involved creating regulatory structures and international institutions that are themselves very fragile.
So to treat this progress as automatic or guaranteed is just naive.
It's deeply naive. And they also briefly mention survivorship bias.
Meaning we're projecting from a position of relative safety.
Right. We are projecting from a historical moment of relative stability, one that has benefited disproportionately from, say, post-World War II geopolitical structures. That might be skewing our perception, leading us to underestimate the likelihood of some catastrophic regression.
But the real intellectual shift in the conversation comes with the qualitative crisis.
This is the core of the critique. The argument suggests that our reliance on material metrics, while useful for measuring survival, utterly fails to capture what we ought to care about when we're discussing human flourishing.
And the evidence for this critique is, well, it's startling, especially in the most materially advanced societies.
It is. The sources cite climbing rates of depression, anxiety, and the tragic increase in what sociologists are calling deaths of despair.
Suicide, drug overdoses, alcohol-related illness.
This signals a massive decoupling between our objective circumstances and our subjective experienced well-being.
And this brings up the classic paradox of advancement, the hedonic treadmill. Objective improvements, getting a better job, buying a new house, having constant digital connectivity, are so rapidly normalized.
We adapt incredibly quickly to better circumstances, and that means the subjective experience of well-being doesn't actually track those objective gains over the long term.
It's like buying a new high-end gadget. For the first 2 days, the joy is immense.
You're on top of the world.
By day 3, it's just a functional object, and by day 30, you're already looking at the next version.
Right. That rapid adaptation completely nullifies the positive emotional impact of the objective gain.
And if this treadmill is constitutive of advanced modernity, then simply accumulating more quantitative advantages, more wealth, more technology, more options, will never fulfill the promise of a better life.
It can't. And this forces us to define what truly constitutes flourishing.
Progress is so often measured in these quantitative terms.
These, they're easy.
More longevity, more wealth, more processing power. They're easily measured, easily benchmarked, and, let's be honest, easily marketed.
Yes. But true human flourishing, the speakers in the source argue, is qualitative.
Like what?
depth of relationship, a subjective experience of meaning and purpose, engagement with beauty and truth, participation in something larger than oneself.
All the things that resist quantification.
Exactly. And crucially, they posit that these qualitative dimensions might actually be undermined by the very engines of material advancement.
Okay, now how does that undermining happen? That seems counterintuitive. More money, more free time should mean more flourishing, right?
You'd think so. But the logic here suggests that the pressure associated with quantitative optimization actually destroys qualitative depth.
Okay, well, unpack that.
When everything is pushed toward efficiency and optimization, when we feel pressure to monetize our hobbies, to optimize our friendships for networking, to maximize every second of our leisure time,
We lose the capacity for experiences that are just intrinsically valuable.
precisely. Activities that lack a measurable outcome, like deep contemplation or slow, unproductive conversation, are systematically devalued by the material progress machine. They're seen as a waste of time.
This moves the conversation beyond just criticizing certain technologies, like social media, to criticizing the entire underlying framework, the worldview itself.
Yes, and that requires what the source calls the Heideggerian critique.
This is a deep structural analysis, isn't it? Suggesting that modernity's characteristic acceleration and instrumental rationality are structurally hostile to human flourishing.
That's the core of it. It argues that modern technology is not just a collection of tools, it is a way of disclosing or revealing the world.
This is the concept of technology as worldview. So how does technology reveal the world to us, according to this critique?
It reveals the world and everything in it, including ourselves, our time, our environment, as standing reserves.
Standing reserve, what does that mean?
It means everything is seen as a resource to be optimized, ordered, and exploited for further production or efficiency.
Okay, let's make that concrete. When we look at a forest and we only see standing reserve,
We see timber volume, we see board feet, we don't see ecological complexity or aesthetic beauty.
and when we look at our own time,
We see hours to be optimized with productivity apps, not hours for open-ended reflection or simple being.
and our social relationships,
They become potential networking opportunities or data streams to be monetized by platforms. The world is reduced to resources, to a standing reserve, whose sole value lies in its potential for future use.
and the most profound part of this critique is the implication. The problem isn't making bad choices about specific technologies, like choosing to use a phone too much.
No, the problem is that the technological worldview itself constrains the very kinds of choices that are intelligible to us. If optimization is the only logic we recognize, how can we even choose things that are intrinsically valuable but also inefficient?
This is a vertiginous conclusion. I mean, if the framework of instrumental choice is the problem, how do we act?
It can lead to a kind of fatalism. I worry that this critique is overly pessimistic. If we accept the Heideggerian view that the framework itself constrains our choices, how do we avoid simple fatalism? Does the source offer any practical antidote?
They do. They address this head on in a section on navigating determinism. They agree that the critique can feel paralyzing, but they refuse capitulation.
Good.
The speakers argue there are possibilities for a free relation to technology,
Okay.
a way of inhabiting this civilization without simply surrendering to its instrumental logic. It's a challenge to be engaged with, not a fate to surrender to.
So we can't escape the framework, but we can operate outside of its logic in specific pockets of our lives.
That's the idea. So what is the practical solution offered?
The core proposed solution is something they call contemplative resistance.
I notice they use the word resistance, not strategy.
A very deliberate choice. They make a point of not offering a strategy because strategy itself is instrumental and therefore part of the problem.
So what does contemplative resistance look like?
Instead, they recommend cultivating spaces and practices that are intrinsically valuable and resistant to that instrumental rationalization.
It sounds like a sophisticated form of intentional inefficiency.
It is exactly that. It means maintaining forms of attention and presence that are threatened by the accelerated tempo of life.
So activities undertaken purely because they constitute a way of being human that we refuse to surrender.
Right, like engaging in art purely for its beauty, reading deep philosophical texts without any immediate application in mind, or engaging in conversation whose only goal is simple mutual understanding, not a measurable outcome.
They don't have a measurable outcome, and that's precisely why they matter and why they act as a form of resistance.
Yes. And finally, Speaker B offers this powerful conclusion about the intellectual task itself. They suggest that the greatest value lies in simply sustaining the conversation.
Meaning?
Maintaining communities of discourse where the dominant narrative that progress is always good and always quantitative can be continuously interrogated rather than just blindly accepted.
So the capacity to question progress itself, to ask whether we are getting better or merely more powerful, is deemed a precious human achievement. The conversation itself is the intrinsic good.
Precisely. The act of thoughtful critique is itself a non-instrumental form of human flourishing, resisting the very framework it analyzes.
Wow, what an extraordinary journey through complexity. We really saw collaborative truth-seeking, not adversarial, point-scoring in action.
We did.
And we witnessed the absolute necessity of that precise linguistic calibration required to engage with these profound, uncertain questions like, what is the self? And is civilization actually improving?
The conversations we analyzed really modeled the pinnacle of intellectual discourse. They showed us how to critique a concept like authenticity or progress, while simultaneously rehabilitating it in a more sophisticated, more ethical, and more intellectually honest form.
That is the essence of genuine dialectical thinking.
It really is.
So for you, the learner, the lesson is clear. Pursuing genuine intellectual mastery is not about using obscure vocabulary just for its own sake.
Not at all.
It is about acquiring the linguistic resources, like epistemic hedging and charitable interpretation, that are necessary to engage with complexity honestly. The value of genuine dialogue, of thinking together and being open to having one's mind changed, is what truly advanced discourse sounds like.
And it's something worth preserving.
Absolutely.
Genuine intellectual maturity is the willingness to sit with uncertainty, to resist easy, definitive answers, and to deploy language that is honest and precise about the limits of one's own knowledge.
And that maturity, paradoxically, makes you more persuasive.
So much more, because you've earned the trust of your interlocutor by refusing to overstate your case.
So, as you navigate your own complex world and make your own choices, we want you to take this final provocative thought with you, drawn directly from our discussion on authenticity. The sources suggested that authentic existence is a perpetual task and a constant negotiation. It is not a state you achieve, but a process you maintain.
So if authenticity is a process, not a final state, how might acknowledging the limits of your own freedom and the constraints of your circumstances, your facticity, how might that actually make your choices more meaningful?
If you stop searching for a buried essence and instead embrace the freedom and the terrifying responsibility of ongoing self-creation, what possibilities does that open up for a life lived well and a life lived truly?
A profound question to consider.
Something to reflect on as you process the insights we've shared today. Thank you so much for joining us for this intense deep dive.
Keep challenging yourselves, keep questioning received wisdom, and keep pursuing that elusive ideal of genuine understanding. Until next time. Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show where we take the most intellectually demanding source material, the kind that makes you want to reach for a strong cup of coffee, and we carve a path straight to the core insights.
And today, we're doing something a little different. We are not just analyzing complex ideas. We are, in a sense, dissecting complexity itself.
That's a great way to put it.
Our source material is pretty unique. It's excerpts from 3 high-level philosophical conversations that really represent the absolute pinnacle of English proficiency. We're talking C2 level.
Right. This is where linguistic mastery meets just pure intellectual rigor.
Exactly.
And we've got insights from these really intense exchanges on, the nature of moral progress, the puzzle of free will, and the function of art. So our mission today is kind of twofold. First, we want to give you the shortcut to understanding the heavy-hitting arguments that were advanced in these discussions.
And second, and I think this is the really fascinating part, we're going to expose the specific linguistic and rhetorical tools that these sophisticated thinkers deploy.
Yeah, how they actually do it.
Think of it this way. Almost anyone can assemble a set of facts. True intellectual power, though, lies in how you articulate the connections between those facts, how you manage nuance.
And how you sustain an argument.
Yes, how you sustain a coherent argument over dozens and dozens of turns. We're really revealing the architecture of eloquence. We're going to show you the grammar and the strategy that separates, basic competence from true mastery.
So settle in. If you want to know not just what makes a powerful argument, but what makes an argument nuanced, precisely articulated, and frankly, impossible to ignore, we are diving right into the sophisticated framework required for advanced discourse. Okay, so let's jump right into the toolbox. It's a really common mistake to assume that vocabulary is the final frontier of language mastery.
Absolutely.
But what these sources reveal is that the real distinction, it comes down to grammatical precision, the ability to express subtlety and nuance without, sacrificing clarity.
Precisely. We're talking about moving past just being grammatically correct and actually achieving grammatical sophistication. And the first key feature that was highlighted in the material was the strategic and very controlled use of the subjunctive mood.
The subjunctive, okay, that often feels like a relic, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's something we really only see in very formal writing or maybe old literature. So why is this sort of archaic feeling mood still so essential in a high-level intellectual debate?
It's because advanced discourse is fundamentally about hypothesis. It's about counterfactuals.
Right.
When you use the subjunctive, you're signaling to your listener that you are dealing with something that is contrary to fact or hypothetical or on your wish.
Okay.
And that adds this crucial layer of detachment, of intellectual hedging to what you're saying. It just instantly elevates the register. So, for example, you could say, if I weren't worried about X, that's fine. It's conversational. But if you change it to, we're not for X, you're signaling something different. You're saying, we're dealing with a theoretical condition here. You're removing the immediacy and you're adding, well, a kind of prestige.
So it's a linguistic signal. It's like a grammatical handshake that says, I'm operating in a high-stakes theoretical space right now.
That's a perfect analogy.
Can you give us a few more examples from the sources and maybe how they function rhetorically?
Sure. Take a common, very formal phrase like, be that as it may.
Right.
That is a highly efficient way of granting the validity of your opponent's point while immediately shifting the focus or preparing a rebuttal. It says, okay, I concede your point, but it doesn't actually dismantle my broader framework.
That's incredibly useful. It shows respect because you're acknowledging what they just said, but you're maintaining the momentum of your own argument.
Exactly. Or consider the phrase, far be it from me to suggest.
I like that one.
It's a perfect rhetorical tool. It signals a kind of self-correction or humility or just caution before you introduce an idea that might be a bit contentious or audacious.
It softens the blow.
It does. It frames the idea as something tentative, and it invites collaboration rather than just making a definitive assertion.
I see. And what about when you're expressing regret or a desire for something?
Well, there's the classic, would that it were so simple.
Yes.
It expresses this often wistful, profound desire for a simpler reality than the one you're actually discussing. It's a moment of reflective pause, acknowledging the frustrating complexity of the topic at hand.
Whether it's moral progress or the nature of free will.
Exactly. So the key takeaway here is that the subjunctive isn't just, decoration. It makes the argument more precise by placing the assertion firmly in the realm of hypothesis or desirability. It really demonstrates a complete command over the language's full expressive resources.
That precision, it leads directly into the second point they made, which is mastering complex conditional chains. We all learn the basic if-then sentences in school. But advanced thought seems to require expressing these highly sophisticated counterfactuals, especially when you're testing a premise.
Absolutely. You have to move beyond simple if-then statements and get into mixed conditionals, where the condition and the result are happening at different times. And these really complex counterfactuals, philosophical and ethical debates, they constantly test the past against the present, or the present against some hypothetical future.
This is where you get those inverted third conditionals, right? Phrases like, had we but known.
Correct. That inversion is so efficient and eloquent. It expresses this deep regret over an unrealized past condition. It's just so much more impactful than the clunky, if we had only known.
The compression itself is part of the eloquence.
It is. And similarly, using the subjunctive in a theoretical framework, we're one to accept that premise. Well, that sets up a formal, distanced, and theoretical line of reasoning. It invites the listener to follow a logical path without necessarily committing the speaker to that premise themselves.
And what about looking to the future?
You hear phrases like, should it transpire that? Which carries this sense of formal, often cautionary or undesirable discovery about what might happen. These complex structures allow the speakers to build these really sophisticated chains of reasoning that can explore multiple possibilities and their dependencies all at the same time.
And you really need that for something like the free will debate.
Oh, absolutely. They use these chains to articulate these complex scenarios like, if determinism were true, would a choice that arose randomly be more free? You need this grammatical depth to even form the question coherently.
Now, let's move to something that feels a little less grammatical on the surface, but is absolutely crucial for the listener: information packaging and emphasis. This is all about how advanced speakers strategically manipulate word order to control the flow of information and, critically, to guide your attention to what matters most.
This is what I'd call the invisible hand of discourse management. It's the difference between just stating a fact and ensuring the listener knows which part of that fact is the central insight, or the new revelation, or the point of urgency.
The sources pointed to 4 key techniques here: fronting, clefting, pseudo-clefting, and extraposition. Let's really slow down here and demonstrate the rhetorical impact of these.
Okay. Take fronting. This just involves moving a phrase that would normally appear later in the sentence, maybe a phrase of time or place, to the very beginning for emphasis.
Okay, so instead of, "I realized the true implications only later,"
You'd say, only later did I realize the true implications. That reversal, that fronting, it puts all the emphasis on the timing of the realization.
Right. The sentence structure itself creates a little dramatic tension.
Precisely. Now, clefting and pseudo-clefting are probably the most powerful tools for focusing attention. A cleft sentence splits a simple sentence into 2 clauses, using it, or what to highlight a specific element.
Let's use the example from the source material. The simple sentence is, "The economic implications concern me most." Pretty flat.
Right. If we use pseudo-clefting, which is the what X is Y structure, we get, what concerns me most is the economic implications.
I see. You've primed the listener's attention by starting with, "What concerns me most?"
Yes, the listener is now anticipating the content of that concern, and the crucial new information, the economic implications, is delivered with maximum impact right at the end of the sentence.
And what about clefting? That's the "it's X that Y" structure.
Using that, the sentence becomes, it's the economic implications that concern me most. Here we put economic implications in the focal position right after it's separating it from the rest of the clause.
And the rhetorical goal is achieved in both cases.
In both cases, yes. The speaker avoids burying the most important point. Imagine you're in a long, complex philosophical argument. If you just use the simple sentence, the urgency is diluted. If you use one of these packaged versions, you're signaling to the listener, pause. This is the core takeaway. This is the center of my anxiety or my argument.
So this isn't just about sounding polished or academic. It's a critical tool for managing the listener's cognitive load in a very complex terrain. It makes sure the nuance is precisely where it should be, making these arguments accessible without dumbing them down.
And these seemingly minor grammatical variations, the sources argue, are the cumulative difference between just competent communication and genuine, powerful eloquence.
Okay, so armed with those sophisticated tools for nuance, the speakers plunge right into the first heavyweight debate. This was Conversation 5. The nature of moral progress. And they immediately establish a very contentious premise.
They do. The core question is, has humanity actually made authentic, deep-seated moral progress, or have we simply exchanged old moral blind spots for new ones?
That's a huge question. It forces us to confront our own, self-congratulation about how enlightened we are.
Right. The speakers rigorously challenge that facile assumption that history is just a simple upward slope towards enlightenment. They start, though, by giving the narrative of progress its due.
They lay out the case for progress, which they call the expanding circle. This is a narrative that's been popularized by ethical philosophers like Peter Singer, and it suggests that the scope of our moral concern has just progressively, demonstrably broadened over time.
And that's the powerful, kind of undeniable evidence, right? Historically, moral consideration was incredibly restrictive. It was often confined to your immediate tribe or your nation or a specific class.
Sure.
And the history of the last few centuries has been the relentless expansion of that circle, from one's own race or gender to all human beings, and more recently extending to non-human animals and even ecological systems.
And you can point to clear historical victories: the abolition of chattel slavery, the extension of suffrage to women and marginalized groups, the post-World War II recognition of fundamental universal human rights. These things are real.
They are real. They aren't just shifts in fashion or semantics. But, and this is the key, the conversation takes a very sharp, skeptical turn toward what they call the triumphalist narrative. And they offer 2 devastating critiques against this idea of naive, inevitable progress.
What's the first one?
The first critique is about fragility and reversibility. And the speaker notes a crucial distinction here. Moral progress is profoundly different from technological progress.
How so?
Well, if we invent the printing press or the airplane, that knowledge is essentially secure. It's irreversible. We don't suddenly forget how to print bikes or build planes.
Right, it's baked into the system. But morality, it's not etched in stone. It's a cultural, intellectual, legal achievement, and it is profoundly vulnerable to decay and collapse.
Exactly. And the speakers use a chilling historical contrast to make this point.
They cite the example of Weimar Germany.
Yes. Consider a nation in the 1920s that was arguably at the apex of global intellectual, scientific, and cultural achievement. I mean, the birthplace of modern physics, psychoanalysis, sophisticated art.
An intellectual powerhouse.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yet within less than 2 decades, that society descended into a barbarism of an unprecedented industrial scale. This example acts as a forceful counterargument to the implicit assumption of moral ratcheting. The idea that once a moral advance is made, it's secure forever.
It shows that what was gained can be horrifically and catastrophically lost.
It's a vital context. It's not just that bad things happen, it's that intellectual sophistication offers no genuine shield against moral collapse. The moral landscape is more like an ecosystem than a building. It needs constant upkeep, and it's vulnerable to catastrophic, rapid environmental change.
And the second critique.
The second critique focuses on novel moral dimensions. Progress isn't just about widening a known circle of concern. It involves the discovery of entirely new moral concerns.
Things we literally didn't have the concepts for before.
Right. As the sources point out, people 300 years ago simply did not debate environmental ethics or the complex duties we owe to future generations, what philosophers call intergenerational distributive justice. These are novel ethical recognitions.
And this leads to a really sobering conclusion they call the vertiginous possibility.
It is vertiginous. If we are currently discovering entirely new dimensions of moral concern that were frankly invisible to our predecessors, then we have to accept the extremely high probability that we are currently morally benighted in ways we cannot possibly fathom right now.
So future generations will look back at us and find some of our common practices just as barbaric as we find slavery.
Intellectual humility demands we sit with that uncomfortable notion. If we're honest about it, every generation believes itself morally superior to the last, and history proves every generation has been profoundly wrong about its own moral completeness.
So if we accept this, if we accept that we probably have these huge blind spots, how do we even begin to search for them? The speakers offer a powerful practical heuristic for this. They call it the harm-benefit asymmetry test.
And this test provides a way to locate potential moral failings. It suggests we look for pervasive social practices that inflict significant harm or suffering on one group,
Okay.
while serving relatively trivial interests or marginal gains for a powerful, dominant group.
And history shows this pattern is diagnostic, right? I mean, slavery inflicted existential suffering for the pretty trivial benefit of cheap labor, especially when other forms of labor were emerging.
Exactly. Child labor inflicted immense harm for what amounted to marginal cost savings. The pattern holds.
So the test immediately highlights what the speakers see as the most compelling contemporary candidate.
Which they immediately cited: industrial animal agriculture.
Let's really unpack that application. Why is this practice the obvious example according to their test?
Because the asymmetry is just so stark. We're discussing the industrial confinement and slaughter of billions of sentient creatures. These are animals subjected to conditions that would, if applied to humans, be immediately categorized as crimes against humanity.
And what's the human interest being served on the other side of that equation?
Well, in the modern wealthy world, where nutritional alternatives are abundant, the interest served is often marginal. It's slight improvements in convenience or palatability, or the cost of a specific type of protein. The suffering is immense and structural. The benefit is, in context, relatively trivial. The test really compels us to confront the moral cost versus the utilitarian gain.
And this leads to a crucial insight about why these blind spots persist in the first place. They're rendered invisible by social systems.
Yes. The slave owner in 1850 didn't usually wake up feeling like a moral monster. They were operating within a social and economic system that normalized and obscured the suffering of others.
So self-scrutiny alone isn't going to cut it.
The speakers argue it's insufficient. We need external perspectives. We need the voices of the marginalized or those who suffer to reveal the moral landscape that we are systematically ignoring or discounting.
Finally, the conversation shifts to the actual mechanism of progress. Is moral progress an intellectual achievement, or is it an emergent property? Does philosophy lead the charge, or does something else?
This is a crucial observation. Moral advances, they note, often coincide with changing material conditions, with technological or economic developments.
So think about the abolition of slavery again.
Right. Moral arguments were critical, absolutely. But those arguments gained real traction precisely when industrialization began to make slave labor economically inefficient and unstable compared to wage labor.
So the changing economic reality created the possibility for the moral recognition to gain a foothold.
Exactly. Moral progress is likely an emergent property of changing social and technological conditions. Technology or the economy opens a door, maybe through increased abundance or new communication methods, and then moral reasoning steps in to interpret those emerging interests and give them a coherent ethical shape.
So reasoning doesn't operate in a vacuum.
No, it requires a stable, often wealthy, material environment to flourish and to enact change. The humility required in this conversation is just immense.
And it's reflected, as we noted at the start, in the linguistic tools they used. The constant hedging, the use of subjunctives to handle the profound uncertainty. It's a recognition that genuine moral progress requires us to pay attention to both the quality of our arguments and the material conditions that allow those arguments to succeed. That discussion on moral progress, particularly the idea of our own moral blindness, is, well, it's profoundly unsettling. It's exactly the kind of topic that, in lesser hands, could just dissolve into shouting or rancor. Yet the speakers maintain this incredible intellectual rigor and grace.
And this brings us to a nice transition, focusing on the specific rhetorical and social skills required for this kind of high-level disagreement. Let's call it the art of disagreement.
Right, because the challenge is avoiding contemptuous dismissal on one side, but also avoiding false consensus on the other, especially when your deepest convictions are being challenged.
And the secret, it seems, lies in achieving genuine intellectual generosity.
How do they model that?
Well, they use highly precise language to signal disagreement while preserving respect. It's a difference between saying, you're wrong, and using a phrase like, I take your point, though I find myself departing from you on this particular matter.
That phrasing ensures the other person knows that you fully processed their argument before you start charting your own course.
It does. And the most important technique they model, I think, is steel manning.
I love this concept. It completely changes the nature of the debate.
It really does. Steel manning is the practice of representing your opponent's position in its strongest, most compelling, most elegant form before you offer your critique.
So instead of attacking the weakest link, the straw man, you actually help your opponent construct their best possible defense.
Right.
Why would you do that? I mean, isn't the goal to win the argument?
Well, the goal of advanced discourse isn't really winning. It's clarifying the truth. If you can only defeat a weak version of an idea, you haven't really refuted the idea itself. But if you manage to defeat the strongest version of that idea, your own position is validated with much greater certainty. It shows impeccable intellectual good faith.
And there are practical phrases they use to do this. You hear things like, if I understand you correctly, you're suggesting that.
Or, the most compelling version of that argument, as I see it, would be, it forces clarity and establishes common ground before you even get to the divergence.
And then finally, there's the maturity to know when to stop, registering a bedrock disagreement.
This happens when arguments just run out of road because the divergence rests on foundational, irreducible intuitions. It's not about facts or flawed logic anymore. It's about fundamental starting assumptions.
And a sophisticated thinker resists that urge to just force consensus at this point. They don't try to shame the other person into agreeing with them.
No. They acknowledge the divergence with language, like, I suspect we may have reached bedrock here, or that wonderfully gracious exit. Perhaps this is an irreducible disagreement, but I'm grateful for the clarity our exchange has brought.
So the value is the clarity you've achieved about the nature of the disagreement itself, not necessarily reaching a consensus.
Exactly. That maturity is the hallmark of genuine intellectual freedom.
Okay, so using those careful techniques of disagreement, the speaker is then moving to conversation 6, tackling what is arguably philosophy's most enduring and contentious puzzle, free will.
The big one.
They immediately define the core conflict between skepticism and compatibilism.
That's right. Speaker A leans towards skepticism, the idea that free will is likely incoherent or illusory, largely because our universe appears to be governed by physical laws, determinism.
And Speaker B leans toward compatibilism, the belief that free will and determinism can, in fact, be reconciled.
They can coexist.
Let's start with the compatibilist stance from Speaker B. What is their primary move to reconcile this? Because intuitively, if everything is caused by prior events, how can my choice right now possibly be free?
So the compatibilists, they make this really powerful but also very subtle argument. They basically suggest that the assumption could have done otherwise. That whole idea that at the moment of choice, all possible futures were open.
Right, that feeling that I could have picked the other thing.
Exactly. They argue that's a kind of philosophical add-on. It's not actually essential to how we function morally day to day.
How so? When do we actually mitigate responsibility in the real world?
We mitigate responsibility only when the action doesn't flow from the person's settled character, their values, their deliberation. So if someone commits a crime because they're under duress, or they're having a severe schizophrenic episode, or maybe a newly discovered brain tumor directly caused the impulse,
we say they weren't acting as themselves. In those cases, the action bypasses their normal mechanism of reason and choice.
Precisely. So the compatibilist reframes the definition of free will. Free will is not about being uncaused. It's about being self-governed. The action is free if it flows from the agent's own reasons, values, and deliberations, even if those underlying reasons are themselves causally determined by their genetics and their environment and their history.
So we praise or blame them because the action reflects who they are.
That's the core of it.
But Speaker A, the skeptic, immediately objects to this. This is the skeptical or libertarian intuition. They argue that this compatibilist view just drains free will of its significant intuitive content.
The skeptic says, look, if you are merely a conduit through which prior causes flow, then you're just a very complicated domino. Genuine authorship, the skeptic insists, requires being the true originator of the action. They want to be the starting point, the unmoved mover.
Okay, but I have to push back here. If compatibilism is about preserving our practical sense of responsibility, and even the skeptic has to acknowledge that the philosophical concept of a purely uncaused choice is probably incoherent, why bother with skepticism? Doesn't the compatibilist just win by providing a working definition?
And that's the core of the intellectual friction in this debate. The skeptic highlights what they see as the inherent dilemma.
Which is?
If choices are caused, freedom is illusory. That's the determinism problem. But, and this is the skeptic's crucial move, if choices are uncaused, as the originator view would require, then they must be random or accidental or capricious.
And randomness is no friend of moral responsibility either. You can't be responsible for a random lightning strike in your brain.
Exactly. So the concept of pure, uncaused, meaningful freedom seems to evaporate regardless of which path we take. The choice is either determined and unfree, or it's random and meaningless.
So either way, that intuitive feeling of moral desert, the sense that someone truly deserves praise or punishment, is undermined.
That's the conclusion the skeptic drives toward, which is when Speaker B raises the critical, pragmatic counterpoint, the question of livability.
Right. Can you actually live as a skeptic?
Can one genuinely, consistently refrain from resentment when you've been wronged, reminding yourself that the person couldn't have done otherwise? Can we genuinely avoid the profound sense that our most difficult decisions, quitting a job, choosing a partner, that they matter, regardless of our philosophical commitments?
So the argument is that even the most committed skeptic finds themselves reverting to the language and practice of responsibility the moment they leave the seminar room.
That's what Speaker B argues, yes.
I find myself skeptical of the livability test itself, though. Isn't the whole point of deep philosophical inquiry that our powerful intuitive feelings, like our sense of agency, might just be powerful illusions? Why is appealing to what is easy to live with a good philosophical standard?
That's a very strong challenge. And the speakers do address it by pointing to what they call the performative tension.
Okay, what's that?
The very act of arguing for skepticism, engaging in reason-giving, presenting evidence, trying to persuade another rational agent, that act presupposes the very rational agency that the skeptic is fundamentally questioning.
So if we're just determined conduits with pre-programmed beliefs, why bother trying to persuade me with reasons?
Why bother? You are acting as if reasons matter, and as if your listener is capable of being moved by them, which in turn undermines the core claim of your skepticism.
That puts the skeptic in a bind. They're performing freedom in the very act of arguing against it.
It creates this internal, inescapable friction, and the conversation ultimately moves toward reaching bedrock. They recognize that the disagreement rests on these foundational, diverging intuitions about what freedom truly requires. Is it metaphysical causation for the skeptic, or self-governance for the compatibilist?
But the crucial insight here is that the value wasn't in finding consensus, but in the exchange itself. In clarifying the terms, tracing the ultimate source of the divergence, and understanding exactly why this question resists a final resolution.
Right. This is the examined life, engaging the essential, difficult questions. And linguistically, this complex debate required incredible precision. They had to deploy those advanced conditional constructions we talked about. Were it the case that, or would a choice that arose randomly be more free, to articulate the subtle distinctions required to separate determinism from self-governance and causality from mere randomness. The grammar had to carry the weight of the metaphysics.
So far, we've seen the tools for individual sentence nuance and the techniques for managing high-stakes disagreement. Now we need to focus on the structural skills needed to manage these highly complex arguments over extended periods of time. This is all about constructing coherence.
That's right. When you're operating at this level, you're not just, writing a paper. You're engaged in a dynamic, extended oral discourse. Mastering the macro structure and discourse management, the overall organization of the argument, is completely non-negotiable.
Because arguments evolve, they loop back on themselves, they pause. The speaker has to be the guide for the listener.
Exactly. This means they use explicit signposting and navigation markers to ensure the listener never gets lost in the intellectual terrain. They are actively managing the flow of information for the benefit of the audience.
So think about the complexity of that free will debate we just discussed. A speaker needs a phrase like,
to return to the point I raised earlier regarding the definition of self-governance, that explicitly pulls a key thread back into the current discussion, and it ensures continuity despite all the intervening complexity.
Or to connect two ideas that might initially seem disparate, you might hear something like, this connects with what we were discussing regarding the fragility of moral progress.
And that phrase creates an immediate intellectual link. It shows the listener the architecture of the speaker's overarching theory. And most powerfully, they prepare the listener for a summary or a conclusion before moving on. The upshot of this entire line of reasoning is,
it's a kind of structural generosity. It gives the listener a moment to synthesize all the previous complexity before moving on to the next intellectual step.
These markers are essentially the table of contents for the listener's mind. They make sure the complex argument isn't just received as a flood of disjointed points. And equally important is framing arguments, setting the context both before and after you dive into the complexity.
And you distinguish between perspective framing and retrospective framing.
Yes. Perspective framing sets the agenda. It tells the listener what's coming. For example, I want to advance 3 considerations, each of which bears specifically on the central question of aesthetic value. First, second, and third.
That sets expectations and allows the listener to slot the incoming information into a pre-established framework. It prevents them from feeling surprised or, overwhelmed.
And retrospective framing, on the other hand, summarizes the progress before moving to a new section. Having examined the phenomenon from these various angles, economic, moral, and technological, we're now in a position to draw some tentative conclusions.
This is mastery because it respects the cognitive load of the listener. It ensures that these dense, complex arguments are actually received and followed clearly. This structural integrity is what separates an articulate speaker from a truly eloquent one who can manage and sustain these intellectual exchanges over long periods. Our final deep dive brings us to the most abstract and perhaps most universally experienced topic: art, meaning, and the human condition. And the speakers immediately establish the puzzle of art's function.
It really is a paradox of human endeavor, isn't it? We invest enormous resources, billions of dollars, centuries of history, immense emotional energy into producing, preserving, and experiencing art.
And yet it serves no direct biological or instrumental need. It doesn't feed us, it doesn't shelter us, it doesn't kill our enemies efficiently.
And yet every single human culture, from the earliest cave paintings to today's digital installations, produces it, which suggests that art answers to some deep universal human need that is surprisingly hard to articulate using purely rational language.
One speaker offers a really powerful answer rooted in what they call the cognitivist view, art as experiential knowledge.
Right. The argument is that great art teaches us something profound about reality that what they call propositional knowledge cannot access.
Okay, we need to spend some serious time on this distinction. What is the difference between propositional knowledge and this experiential knowledge that art supposedly conveys?
So, propositional knowledge is information that can be summarized in statements, facts, or data points. For example, the proposition, human beings experience loss and mortality.
Right, that's a summarizable fact. Once you hear it, you possess the fact.
But experiential knowledge, that's a felt understanding. It's a transformation of your perception or a deepening of your acquaintance with reality. Art doesn't just convey the fact, It helps us know what it's like to live that fact. And the speakers argue that the pleasure we take in art is not separate from the learning. They call it the learning pleasure synthesis. The pleasure is the medium through which the revelation occurs. We don't enjoy a symphony and then separately gain an insight.
The pleasure is the insight.
The pleasure is the insight. It is the satisfaction of seeing chaos briefly crystallized into form, of feeling an emotion or an experience articulated with unexpected perfection.
Let's test this by challenging the propositional view, which they do through the role of tragedy. They use the classic examples like King Lear or Oedipus Rex.
Right. If art were only propositional, reading King Lear would be completely pointless because the proposition is a banality. Kings can suffer, families betray each other.
We know this fact already.
We do. But the reason we return to these great works is that tragedy gives us an experiential encounter with suffering. It forces us to inhabit the psychological landscape of loss, betrayal, and madness, and that moves abstract knowledge into an intimate, felt understanding.
It also explains why we return to great works over and over again.
Absolutely. If a novel or a film only conveyed a simple proposition, one viewing would be enough. But because the understanding is a felt grasp, a subjective internal reality, it requires repeated engagement. Each time we return to it, we deepen that internal acquaintance. We bring our new life experience to the work, and the work in turn transforms us slightly.
Now, shifting a bit, the conversation explores a deeper, more existential function: art and existential meaning.
In a modern, often disenchanted world, art speaks to the human need for significance and coherence.
And the speakers suggest it fulfills a kind of quasi-religious function. It takes over a role that was once held by myth and shared narrative and ritual.
Yes, it provides a framework where existence, which can often seem arbitrary and cruel, feels meaningful, or at least worthwhile. But they make a very careful distinction here.
Right, art doesn't provide a dogma or a worldview that we have to adhere to.
No, instead it creates what they call bounded spaces of intensified significance.
That's a beautiful phrase.
It is. Think of a perfect painting or a moving piece of music. For that brief moment, the chaos of the world crystallizes into a pattern, and contingency is momentarily redeemed by form. That imposed structure, that momentary feeling of perfection or completeness, it satisfies a deep primal need for coherence.
That framework helps clarify the twofold power of great art: consolation and disturbance. It can be intensely comforting, but also deeply unsettling.
It consoles because it imposes aesthetic order on chaos. It suggests that even the most excruciating human experiences can be contained or understood or rendered beautiful within a formal boundary.
But it also disturbs.
It disturbs by revealing dimensions of existence we would prefer to ignore. It shatters our comfortable illusions, challenges our sense of normalcy, and expands the boundaries of human possibility, both the magnificent and the terrible.
And finally, they land on what they deem the deepest function: their conclusion. Art is ultimately the guardian of mystery.
I think this is so profound. Art's ultimate function is not to provide instrumental answers or efficient solutions. It actively resists the world's constant threat of reducing everything to calculation and useful function.
It holds open the space of questioning.
It holds open the space of questioning, of wonder, of perplexity. Art doesn't solve the human condition. It merely reminds us that the human condition is worth investigating and that it resists final closure.
And the conversation itself, in a way, mirrors this function. It was an attempt to understand something art that by its very nature resists final, complete understanding. It chose instead to just dwell productively in the question.
What an intellectually expansive journey we've taken. I mean, we've explored the mechanics of true C2 level eloquence. We've wrestled with the uncertain and reversible nature of moral progress, analyzed the profound tension in the free will debate, and finally, looked at the existential necessity of art as the guardian of mystery.
And for you, our dedicated listener, let's try to distill the core key takeaways to bring back into your own intellectual life and conversations. First, precision over complexity. Sophisticated discourse is defined by a kind of surgical precision in language, using specific linguistic resources like the subjunctive or these clefting structures to express nuanced ideas, not just by accumulating a large vocabulary.
Second, intellectual virtues. Mastery demands so much more than just innate intelligence. It requires humility, the charitable interpretation of opposing views through steel manning, and the maturity to acknowledge when you have reached a bedrock disagreement without resorting to antagonism.
And third, Structural integrity. The ability to sustain complex thought requires mastering that macrostructure, the skill of organizing, framing, signposting, and managing arguments over multiple turns to ensure your powerful ideas are actually received and followed clearly.
We began this whole deep dive by questioning what we can genuinely know, and we concluded with art as the guardian of mystery. If, as that final conversation suggested, art's deepest function is to hold open the space of questioning and preserve the dimension of existence that resists final, instrumental comprehension, well, this raises one final provocative thought for you to explore.
What fundamental human need does our own constant inquiry, our relentless deep dives, our search for knowledge, our intellectual striving to impose order on the informational chaos ultimately satisfy?
Are we, too, seeking a momentary redemption from chaos through the imposition of intellectual form? Are we striving for coherence not just to advance a position, but because, like art, that momentary structure is essential to making life feel significant and worthwhile?
That's a profound thought that transcends philosophy and really touches on the very reason we pursue knowledge. Until our next deep dive, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep aspiring to that level of rigorous eloquence.
Take care, and thank you for joining us.